If you look 200 years ago, East Asia accounted for 40% of the world's income. And people lose sight of that because of what's happened since. From 40% of the world's income, over 200 years, it declined to 12% by 1950, right after the war. If you look at Europe, Western Europe and the U.S., in the year 1800, it accounted for about 25%, 28% of the world's production. It currently now counts together for about 50%. In another 10 or 15 years, East Asia's share of world production will rise back to 40%, exactly what it was 250 years ago. So some people look at the rise of East Asia not as a new phenomenon, but actually the restoration of a phenomenon that actually existed many hundreds of years ago. Now, what I'd like to talk about is what's been happening in East Asia, but I wanted to put it into context. The context is you're seeing the resumption of a region whose economic strength was very, very high and is now coming back to that level. The growth. The story for East Asia's success is fairly well known. It's based on sound macroeconomic policies, high investment savings rates, strong export promotion, strong export orientation, competitive industries, emphasis on education. But this particular model largely is built upon high savings, high investment. East Asian countries save about 30 to 40 to 50% of their income. They invest at a level which is about 50% higher than most other regions. As a consequence, it grew incredibly fast. But this model of high savings, high investment has now changed dramatically. It is moving to a model which is much more focused on innovation and technology, and that's the reason I wanted to get into this subject today. This growth, based largely upon scale economies in the production process. And this scale economies in the production process is largely due to trade. Trade has promoted innovation and specialization. That's one aspect. The other aspect is tremendous economies of scale and efficiency from what I would call the agglomeration effects from the urbanization process. Now, two things are very different today between the trade process in East Asia today compared to the past. The first is that the process has fostered very close collaboration across countries, although it was never deliberate. It was totally market-driven. This degree of collaboration across countries, which I'll get into, is really unique to East Asia. Secondly, it promoted a process of specialization, which again never occurred before. This combination of collaboration coupled with specialization has totally transformed the region and made it extraordinarily more productive than any other region in the world today. And it largely explains the growth process. Trade in high technology products has grown enormously. It's encouraged innovation through technology development, more responsive business services, spread of IT, and enhanced logistics capacity. China's rise, both as an exporter and an importer, has been an integral part of this process. Now, what's been unique in terms of the trade process in East Asia is the very large concentration of trade in parts and components. And this feature is actually missed. People in the West see imports coming from East Asia, a finished product. It could be a shoe, it could be a computer, it could be a TV. They don't realize the extent that that's made of parts and components produced in multiple countries. A disk drive coming from Thailand will have been shipped to 11 different countries before it's been finished. Before it would have maybe gone to 2 or 3 countries. Now, the extent of the trade in parts and components shows up in the export and import numbers. And you can see that over the last 10 years, trade in parts and components, both in terms of imports and in terms of exports, has been growing about twice as fast as any other share of the components that are being traded. Now, another thing that's happened is that the transfer of technical experience, the transfer of technology, is occurring largely through imports of high technology valued capital equipment. In a survey of 15,000 firms that we carried out in Asia across 10 countries, the question we asked is, what is the major source of your acquisition of technology? 45% of the firms basically said it comes from imports of high technology equipment. The next three answers, in-house R&D, hiring staff with the skills, buying technology, each of the next three reasons accounted for no more than 10%. Now, this has also transformed the way we actually look at trade. We used to think of trade, we used to focus on exports as the big push on technology innovation. In fact, today, the big push on innovation comes through imports. And because it's imports that is actually transferring the technology and expertise to these countries. Now you can see how important parts and components are in the trade of East Asia compared to trade elsewhere in the world. The EU is still the country with the highest ratio of trade to GDP. East Asia is second now. But trade in parts and components in East Asia as a percentage of trade is the highest globally. And this is continuing. Now, why is this important? It's important because you can achieve economies of scale by producing a tiny part. You can achieve economies of scale even though you're a small country. You can achieve economies of scale even though you're a small firm, but you're the best in that part. And this allows you to specialize to an extent that you never could specialize before. You might not be able to produce the whole computer, the whole TV, the whole car, but if you're the best in one aspect, you can compete. And that is what's happening in East Asia. People have suddenly discovered that it's not actually good to produce the whole part. It's not actually good to produce the final product. It's much better to produce the parts and components and be part of a production chain. And this is a phenomenon which is really unique to East Asia. Now, as a very simple example, let me just take what happened in China and Hong Kong in terms of technology upgrading. You can see between 1994 and 2004 that the share of exports in labor-intensive and resource-intensive manufacturers declined substantially from 46% of its exports to 31%. And this basically was offset by increases in exports of medium technology and high technology manufacturers. Medium technology going from 11 to 15%, high technology going from 23 to 35%. But the unique thing is that this pattern of moving up the technology ladder is not specific only to China. It's actually occurring in every country in East Asia because they're all part of the same production chain. The same kind of technology pattern in other parts of the world over the last 10 years, those kinds of splits actually have not changed much. Only in East Asia has this rapid movement up the chain been so dramatic. Now, the great irony is that having achieved this technology shift up what I would call the value-added chain, most countries in East Asia have now learned, in fact, that there's no money made in production. There's no money made in manufacturing. It's all being made in the processes. It's all being made in the marketing. It's all being made in the supply management. It's all being made in the design. It's all made in the retail. So what you're going to see, in fact, over the next 10 years is a dramatic shift in attention away from what I call the pure manufacturing angle of the production chain to greater realization that the design, the marketing, the distribution, the retail aspect, controlling the process, that's where, in fact, the next stage of innovation is going to occur in East Asia, and away from what I would call product development. Trade in parts and components has essentially ensured that the composition of products being traded across countries are becoming more or less the same across all countries, rich or poor. Now, it was in the olden days the case where Japan exported high technology and every other country imported things which were of lower technology, and they all exported products which were different. Now what you see in East Asia is that their export composition is more or less becoming similar. And it's very much focused on machinery, electronics, spare parts and components going into machinery and electronics. And this is a consequence of what I would call both collaboration and specializing. Now, because of this collaboration and specializing, because of the movement to production of goods which there are economies to scale, exports are increasingly growing fastest in areas like the instruments, electrical machinery, electronics, non-electronics machinery, iron and steel, and the share of wood products, footwear, leather, apparel, textiles, that's becoming much smaller in China. It's becoming much smaller in East Asia. And I remember sort of a year or two ago when I was in Spain, the big issue in Spain was China, East Asia, was dominating the market in areas like textiles and footwear and toys and apparel. And the major concern was, how can Spain compete? The reality is China is asking the same question today. It realizes, in fact, that in another 5 to 10 years it will not be exporting footwear, leather, textiles. These are all starting to move to South Asia. Eventually they're all going to move to Africa. But East Asia is going to continuously be exporting more and more of the products you see on the top of this graph here. As a consequence of this trade-based specialization, if you plot the technology composition of East Asia exports against its per capita income, you'll find that practically all countries in East Asia are exporting goods whose technology levels exceed what you would predict given how wealthy they are. They've been able to move up the technology ladder much faster than normal, given their per capita income levels. They're all on the right-hand side of this line. Now, given Asia's success, why is innovation so vital? And the reality is Asia is feeling a lot of pressure. The middle-income countries, China included, they're starting to lose price competitiveness in lower technology products due to rising labor costs. As hard as it may seem, increasingly in the newspapers in China, you see articles about labor shortages. And this is really surprising. Here is a country with 1.3 billion people. And it's starting to say, I can't get workers. I can't get them from the rural areas. It's becoming costly. I've got to move to different product lines. Now, pressure from China as it moves up to different product lines is putting pressure on other countries in the regions to move up to higher technology commodities. This competition, in turn, is pushing all countries to focus more on business services, IT services, supply chain management, and away from production. Now, what we see in Asia is the same thing we see globally. The pace of innovation, the commercialization of innovation has accelerated dramatically. If you classify innovation as 4 different aspects: product development, process development, business and financial service development, transactional development, you see that the big changes are occurring in the latter 3. The processes, the service development, the transactional development. And the major reason, of course, is ICT. Information technology has improved the speed and efficiency in which you can manage supplies, you can sell goods, you can move things. And this is what East Asia is now focusing on. Now, the nature of competition in East Asia is heavily oriented toward a certain class of goods. This class of goods is very competitive in terms of price, quality, delivery. These are decisive. But Asia has just about tapped all the benefits and efficiency gains it can get from cutting prices or being very careful about prices, of getting the quality up to international standards, ensuring that delivery schedules are being met. They're starting to think about other aspects of innovation. They're starting to think about design, brand names, after-sales services, reputational enhancements. If we look at the factors which are affecting innovation in East Asia, there are some things we can generalize. Some aspects of innovation tend to occur among large companies, more so than small companies. You can break it down into which ones tend to be easier done by large or only done by large, and which ones tend to be more done by smaller companies. You also see that some aspects of innovation are more likely to occur among new companies than old companies. That's showing up in our surveys. If you measure innovation by changing product lines, changing the way you do businesses, what we see is that there is no difference in the pace of change between very poor countries and very wealthy countries. Innovation does not seem to be only a rich country or middle country phenomenon. It is also occurring in poor countries in East Asia. Fourth, we see that state-owned companies, state-owned monopolies tend to be not as much aggressive on innovation as private companies. Sixth, we see that companies which tap external financing in any way tend to be much more innovative than companies which do not. And lastly, we see that sectors which are very competitive are more innovative. That if countries as well as sectors have life too easy, change does not occur. So a big challenge for governments is, how do I put pressure on my companies? How do I put pressure on my sectors? Because if I don't, the process of innovation just does not happen. Now, there are three major product groups. The first is category 1, electronics, white goods. White goods are the refrigerators, the stoves, washing machines, automobiles. This is the category which most of the trade, most of the exports, most of the innovation is occurring in East Asia. The second category is large-scale equipment and machinery, transport equipment, plant equipment. China, Japan, a few countries, they're starting to get into category 2. Category 3, metallurgical and petrochemical products, equipment. Third category, very little innovation in those categories, very, very cyclical. Now, the characteristics of category 1 products, these products are driving the innovative process, the competition in East Asia. They're subject to rising demand globally. They're easy to commoditize. You can standardize it. You can give specifications. You can define each part. You can tell who should produce it. You can put it together. There's rapid innovation because people are specializing. Suppliers are in contact all the way down the vertical supply chain. There's very short production cycles. Prices are falling, relatively speaking. Now, in category 2, technical change is much slower. The products are more differentiated, more customized. You can't influence the price. You can influence the price a bit more. Experience and acquired knowledge is actually important. It's not actually easy to gain it. After-sales service is very important. The prices are less volatile. In this category, innovation is slower. It tends to be more incremental. And in category 3, production investment is very capital intensive. Technologies are much more stable, non-changing. Major innovations are infrequent. Prices are very volatile. There are frequent worldwide market disruptions. For East Asia, right now, category 1 is driving innovation. I'm only going to focus on that. Because of time limits, I won't get into the other categories. There continues to be expanding global demand. Trade barriers are coming down. Competition is occurring globally. East Asia has an advantage currently because of its labor. Labor costs, skill levels, trainability, flexibility, it gives it a comparative advantage. Efficiency in manufacturing is critical. East Asia has been very good at this. Foreign direct investment, very important. It brings in capital, it brings in technology. It's relatively easy for firms to enter and exit. East Asia is beginning to learn a major lesson. A major lesson is that you must facilitate entry of new companies, very low cost, but equally important, you must facilitate exit of new companies at very low cost. Those markets in which exit and entry can occur easily and low cost are much more innovative than others, minimizing the costs of losses since innovation is so risky is an important lesson. Category 1 products are decomposable. You can break them into parts and components. You can produce it through a production network. This allows innovation to proceed. It provides flexibility. It lowers costs. It provides linkages across countries and markets. Let me skip the mid-level, high-level. And get to the issues which drive innovation and technical change. And let me focus a little bit about research and development spending. As economists, we know that expenditures on research and development tends to be too low. It's true for every country. It's true for an industry. Now, why is it true? It's true because the returns to R&D, the public returns to R&D exceed the private returns because once you get the knowledge out there, it's easily captured by others. So the commercialization of knowledge, protecting that is difficult. So countries as well as companies tend to do less R&D than would be warranted in a country or national sense. So practically all governments basically realize that they have to somehow support R&D more than normal, and that's been happening, and we'll get into that. All countries realize that much of the innovation, much of the new technology is being developed outside of East Asia. 80% of it is being developed in the developed countries. How do they get it? And they get it from foreign direct investment, but they get it from other means. They get it from tapping technology, and I'll get into that. They also realize that their labor force is not quite up to snuff. Traditionally, East Asian education systems have been seen as producing people who are very good in mechanical or manual or repeating, but not very good in creative activities, and that's starting to change. East Asia also realizes it has to get market systems up that would encourage new entrants and also speed up the disappearance of firms which fail. And it also needs to increase the supply of venture capital and conventional financing to support new startups and R&D. And that's what you're seeing today in terms of the markets in Asia is one example of the flood of money which is coming back to East Asia to support these kinds of activities in every form and way. And lastly, East Asia is beginning to realize that intellectual property rights are important. It wasn't seen as very important 10 years ago, but is now seen as quite important. And they realize it's important because without intellectual property rights, the benefits from R&D, the benefits from patenting will not be captured by companies. So slowly they begin to act aggressively on this. Now let me get into some of these issues. Tapping foreign technology. A large chunk of the foreign direct investment going to East Asia is now originating from within East Asia. It used to always come from the West. Now more than half of it comes from within the region. Now the money which is coming from within the region is usually designed to establish production for exports to OECD countries. The money which comes from OECD countries usually comes in to establish markets within Asia. So East Asia is benefiting from a combination of FDI for two different purposes. It's also very effective, complementing each other. Now some countries have not relied upon FDI. In fact, two of the most innovative countries really discourage FDI, and that is basically South Korea and Taiwan. They have basically relied upon buying the technology overseas, training the people in-house, and not having foreign investors come in. So what we see in East Asia is that there are alternative ways of getting expertise, whether it's through foreign investment or acquiring the technology yourself. And here's a graph which shows royalty payments being made as a percentage of GDP for foreign technology. And generally speaking, East Asian countries show up as paying a lot more than other regions for foreign technology. That's one way that they acquire it. They're much more inclined to do so. The next way is through R&D. R&D expenditure in East Asia is increasing rapidly. It's increased five-fold over the past decade. Increased research and development expenditures in East Asia accounts for 3/4 of the total increase of all developing countries over the last decade. If you look at China, its research and development as a percentage of GDP went from 0.8% to 1.2%, 50% increase in the ratio. This is very large because its GDP has been growing at 10%. So R&D has been growing at 1.5 times as fast, so it's at least 15% a year increase in R&D. Now, if you look at developed countries, the share of R&D for developed countries over the past decade has essentially been unchanged. 2.3% 10 years ago is 2.3% today. For East Asia, it's gone from 0.7 to 1.2%. So for many of the countries in East Asia, their expenditures on R&D is increasing very rapidly. Now, who pays for the R&D and who carries out the R&D in East Asia? The profile in East Asia is quite similar to that for developed countries. It's not similar to what it is for developing countries. Essentially, commercial businesses carry out 60% or more of the R&D, and it's about the same for developed countries. Where it's different is that in East Asia, the government's role is bigger. Governments carry out about 20% or more of R&D in East Asia, where in the developed countries, it's more like 13%. And the reason is because East Asia's higher education systems are not as well developed as they are in the developed world. In developed countries, a large chunk of R&D is being carried out by educational establishments, higher universities. Now, the sector of funding, again, about half the money to fund R&D comes from businesses, a third or so from government, and a small percentage is generated internally within higher education. And this is actually quite similar to what it is in developed countries. But it's quite different from what's happening in other developing countries. A consequence of what's happening is that East Asia is now becoming a rather extraordinary generator of new ideas. And this was not the case 10 years ago. 10 years ago, East Asia was seen as very good at copying, adapting, but not generating new ideas. And one measure of this is patents. It's very hard to get good information or quantifiable information. But if you look at the patents registered in the U.S., you'll see that in the U.S. annually, about 190,000 patents are registered annually in the U.S., 190,000. Of that 190,000, about 100,000 come from U.S. companies. 100,000 of the 190,000 comes from the U.S. companies. 35,000 comes from Japan. Another 30,000 comes from Western Europe in total. So Western Europe generates patents about the same amount as Japan. Now, East Asia 10 years ago essentially had no patents. Very few, practically nothing, 100 or something, 100 annually. It's now 12,000. It's increased six-fold over the last decade. Now, to give you an example, 12,000 patents being generated by East Asia annually. The total for all of Latin America annually is 400. Latin America increased from 150 to 400 annually over a decade. East Asia increased from 100 to 12,000 over a decade. And they curve, and you can see from these curves in the diagram, the curves are increasing exponentially. So it's actually started to change itself in terms of its acquisition of ideas and what it wants to do with these ideas. Now let me go to a related aspect. There's one other aspect of East Asia's growth and its innovation which is also unique. It's linked to the rise of the mega cities in Asia. Urbanization is occurring more rapidly in East Asia than any other region. And it has an unintended positive byproduct. It promotes what we called or talked about this morning, clustering. It promotes agglomeration of activities. It promotes economies of scale. Now, these same cities, which are getting huge, are feeling pressures to generate new kinds of activities. They're starting to get rid of their manufacturing. They're starting to move into services. They're starting to move in technology because they can't compete in terms of labor-intensive activities. And let me very quickly get to the major cities: Tokyo, Osaka, Seoul, Shanghai, the Pearl River Delta, Hong Kong, Bangkok, Taipei, Singapore, Jakarta, Manila. And let me very quickly get to something in terms of what we see as new innovative activities which will define these cities in the future. Tokyo. 10 years from now, I think you'll see it as the center for robotic technologies. Huge linkages, huge possibilities, something which no one else is quite developing as much as they are. Korea. You think of Korea as LCD TVs, heavy equipment. You don't think of Korea as video games in the movie industry. That's their strength in the future. Beijing is clearly computers and IT. Bangkok, fashion, design, and jewelry. Very unique. And Singapore, we already talked about it. Basically biomed. Thank you very much.